Hey, thanks for watching. We've got some fascinating stuff to look at in connection with this Sunday's gospel reading, which is from Luke chapter 10, the very end of that chapter. It's a story of when Jesus visits the home of Mary and Martha. So like we do in all the videos, we're going to look at the Old Testament background of this story because there's a couple of ways in which the Old Testament really helps us to understand some of the language it's used in this section. We're also going to see how Jesus bucks the rabbinic system of his day by comparing what happens in this narrative with an almost contemporaneous document known as the Pirkei Avot, which is kind of a foundational rabbinic collection of proverbs and traditions about the rabbis. And we're also going to see how some of the Greek in this particular section is reflected in other parts of the New Testament as well as the Septuagint, and how these other uses of Greek phraseology can help us to have a little bit fuller understanding of what's happening at the end of Luke chapter 10. So let's dive right in. So what happens in this story is Jesus is visiting the city of Bethany, and he goes into the home of Mary and Martha. And of course, as you probably remember from the story, the two sisters are engaged in very different activities. Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, and she's listening to his word. And Martha is doing all the preparations. She's getting everything ready for Jesus. And she goes to Jesus, and she complains that Mary is not helping out. So she tells Jesus to tell Mary to help her. And then Jesus responds by saying that Mary has chosen the better part, and that Martha is worried and anxious about a lot of things. So that's the story. So how can the Old Testament help us to understand this? How can we get a better understanding by comparing this with some of the rabbinical traditions of the day? Well, let's see. First of all, we're told that Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus, and she's listening to his word. Now, this could have been meant quite literally, but we do know that sitting at someone's feet was a metaphorical way of saying that you are now a student or a disciple of the one at whose feet you sit. So Mary could have been sitting there quite literally listening, or it might be a metaphorical way of saying that Mary was being discipled by Jesus. That is, he was in the position of a rabbi, she was in the position of a student, and she was receiving the word that he was teaching her. We know, for instance, from Acts chapter 22, that Paul, when he describes how he was a student of the celebrated Rabbi Gamaliel, he says that he sat at Gamaliel's feet. It's sometimes translated he was educated by Gamaliel, but literally that's what the Greek says. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. He was in the same position as Mary in relation to Jesus. Mary sat at the feet of Jesus. Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel. And there's also a very significant first century or second century Jewish document known as Pirkei Avot, which translate into something like the chapters of the fathers. Sometimes the title is translated as the ethics of the fathers. And this same kind of image is used there. A rabbi says that one is to make one's house a house for the sages, and to sit in the very dust of their feet, and to drink in their words with thirst. So, three occasions, Luke 10, Acts 22, and Pirkei Avot, we have this image of sitting at one's feet as the description of being a student or a disciple, a learner from a particular rabbi. Now, when I said earlier that Jesus bucked the rabbinic system of his day, here's what I mean. In that same exact section of Pirkei Avot, where it says that you're to make your house a house for the sages and to sit in the dust of their feet and drink in their words, the very next section in Pirkei Avot says more or less that you should refrain as much as possible from talking with women, to keep it to a bare minimum, not to spend a lot of time conversing with women. So it goes from saying sit at the feet of the rabbi, drink in their words, to don't talk very much with women because that's going to distract you from studying the Torah. Now, this is, as I said earlier, this is almost contemporaneous with what's happening in the New Testament. And you juxtapose that with what is happening in Luke chapter 10. Not only does Jesus welcome Mary, a woman, to sit at his feet and be his disciple, to be his learner as he is in the position of a rabbi, but he's having this conversation, not only with Mary, but he has a conversation, a back and forth with Martha as well. So unlike the rabbis of his day, Jesus is welcoming these women to sit at his feet, to learn from him, so that he can be a rabbi, a teacher to them, and they, his students, his disciples. So this is, of course, just one of many instances in which Jesus, as a rabbi, was doing what was considered very unrabbinical in his day. So that's one of the things that I think is really fascinating when you compare what's happening in Luke 10 with kind of some of the other traditions of his day. Secondly, what's going on with Martha? Well, Martha, as we know, is very distracted. She's getting all these preparations ready for Jesus. And the Greek word that's used to describe what is going on with Martha is perispao. Now, perispao is one of these real visual sorts of Greek words. It literally means to be dragged around. We might translate it to be pulled in every direction. Or if kind of in a southern translation of the Bible, we might say that Martha was running around like a chicken with her head cut off. So she's perispao. She's distracted. She's pulled this way and that. This same Greek word is used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, in the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 1, as well as in chapter 3. And the context is basically saying that it's really rough for people who live under the sun because it is a hard task that God has given us to be busy with. And that translation, busy with, is the same Greek verb, to perispao. So it's hard to live on earth because we're pulled in every direction. We're dragged around. We're perispao. And that's what's happening here with Martha. So she's being pulled in every direction while her sister Mary is sitting there at the feet of Jesus. And now we come to Jesus' response to Martha when she comes to him and says, basically, tell my sister to lend me a hand. Tell her to help me. What does Jesus do? Well, here we come upon, I think, the two most important words in this section of Luke. And these two words are simply this: Martha, Martha. That's what Jesus says. He says, Martha, Martha, and then he goes on to tell her how she's anxious and worried about many things. Now, I'm one of those who likes to look at any particular section of Scripture in the light of the entirety of Scripture, because I don't think there's anything is there by accident. It's all divinely designed to fit into this huge biblical matrix, if you will, or this web of meaning that's interconnected from Genesis to Revelation. So I took a look at all the occurrences in the Bible where there's a double use of names, where the same name is repeated twice. And there's about 10 of these. And what's fascinating is that in almost every single one of these, when there's a double repetition of the name, it's at a very critical point in this person's life. So it's not just kind of a passing comment like we might say to someone, oh, John, John, or oh, Susie, Susie, or whatever it might be. No, when the Bible repeats a name, it happens at critical junctures in a person's life. Let me give you a couple examples. The first occurrence of this duplication of the name is in Genesis chapter 22. It's when Abraham has taken Isaac up onto the mountain, and he literally has the knife in his hand by which he is going to sacrifice his son, and the angel stops him by saying, Abraham, Abraham. And then he goes on, of course, to have a conversation with Abraham. But that's the way it starts out, a double repetition of Abraham's name in this very important, very critical turning point in Abraham's life. Secondly, and later in Genesis, when Jacob finds out that Joseph is still alive and that he's like the vice regent of Pharaoh, and he and all his family are supposed to go down into Egypt, Jacob hesitates. He's a little bit reluctant to leave the promised land and to go down into Egypt. And so God says to Jacob, Jacob, Jacob. And then he assures him that he's going to be with him and everything is going to be okay. So this is another critical point in the life of Jacob where a double use of his name occurs. Let me give you one more example, this one from the New Testament. And this is when Saul is on his way to persecute Christians, to arrest them, and God appears to him, Christ speaks to him from heaven and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Once more, double repetition of the name, and of course, a critical juncture in Paul's life, because of course, this is when he is converted and becomes not only a Christian, but of course, will then later become an apostle to the Gentiles. So, and there's a lot of other occurrences of these. I said there's about 10 in all. Now you think about that double repetition of Martha's name in Luke chapter 10. This was a critical juncture, in other words, in Martha's life, because in this short exchange that she has with Jesus, this is when she realized that which is most important. Jesus is turning her life, as it were, by the double use of her name. And This duplication of the name, when you look at it in the rest of the scriptures, now makes sense. We see how significant this narrative is. I mean, when you think about it, why did Luke include this? I mean, of all the stories, of the hundreds or thousands of stories about Jesus that Luke could have included in his gospel, he chooses to include this. And why is that? Well, because it was that important. This was a critical juncture in Martha's life, and that's why Jesus uses this double repetition of her name. And then one more thing. Martha says to Jesus, "Lord, don't you care that my sisters left me to do all the work?" Twice in the Gospels, Jesus is asked, "Don't you care?" Here, of course, and then in Mark chapter 4. You remember the story. The disciples and Jesus are crossing the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up, and somehow Jesus is like asleep in the boat. He's not even aware, seemingly, of what's going on. And his disciples wake him up, and they say, "Lord, don't you care that we are perishing?" The Greek there is ou mele. Same construction that we find in Luke chapter 10. And in both cases, of course, Jesus responds with sort of a mild rebuke to the disciples. He calms the storm, and he says, oh, you men of little faith. And here he rebukes Martha. And so in both cases, there's an expression, yes, of concern, in which Jesus actually gives wisdom and understanding and a better perspective to those who are involved in this. So in the end, we have Jesus saying to Martha, "You're anxious and you're worried about many things, but really Mary has chosen that which is the better part." Mary has focused upon that which she is now doing, sitting at my feet and receiving my word. And I think there's a couple of different ways that you can take this, both exegetically as well as homiletically. One is kind of the traditional way to say that Mary has chosen that which is better because she's chosen to listen to Jesus' word. She's chosen to sit at his feet and be his disciple, and he, her rabbi, to learn from him. And certainly that has plenty of exegetical support and has found its way into multitudes of sermons. I think another way that you can take this is more vocationally. There was absolutely nothing wrong with what Martha was doing. She was getting the meal ready. She was doing her service, her diakonia in Greek, which is sometimes translated as ministry or service or work. So she's doing that, which is just fine. It's not as if Martha should have just dropped everything and sat down beside Mary. I think what one way that we could take is that Mary was focused upon being there with Jesus. And Martha, too, even though she was active, could have focused also upon being there with Jesus. The problem with Martha was not just that she was just not sitting there beside Mary, but the problem was that she was perispatos. She was pulled in all these different directions instead of focusing singularly, one-mindedly upon that vocation that she had been given, that of service, that of activity. So I think there's a couple of different ways that you could take what it means to choose the better part at the end of Luke chapter 10. So we got the rabbinic parallels with the Pirkei Avot and how Jesus is bucking the rabbinic system. We have very significantly the double repetition of Martha's name. I think that we really need to reflect a little bit more upon the true significance of that and the true significance it had in Martha's life when we compare this with other occurrences in Scripture like that. So there's a lot going on in the text, and I hope that this has helped you a little bit to have a better understanding of this particular narrative from Luke's Gospel. So thanks for watching, as always, and I pray that God will bless you this Sunday if you hear this text read and preached on, and that you'll have a little bit richer and deeper understanding of exactly what's going on. So thanks for watching, and have a great day.